Hello, I'm Jess Robertson. I work on the programme and curatorial team at Modern Art Oxford. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the event this evening titled Spaces in Between, Critical Approaches to Care and Collectivity Online. With thanks to support from Torch as part of the Humanities and Cultural programme, this event has been programmed alongside Breathworks, a digital participatory project at Modern Art Oxford led by artist and researcher Lucy Sabin and curated by my wonderful colleague, Andre Latham. Breathworks was initiated before the 2020 health crisis began, and the idea behind the project was to explore communal breath awareness online. The project, which took on renewed political and social significance in the context of the pandemic, invited participants to capture an experience of breathing via image and sound recording. These were displayed on the Modern Art Oxford website and Instagram to form a collection of stories exploring collective and individual experiences of breath and breathing. Last week, we held the first Breathworks public programming event, Breathing Worlds, which was a fascinating discussion of the political, personal, and environmental worlds in which we breathe. If you missed this live event, we'll be sharing a recording in the coming weeks, so do look out for this on the Modern Art Oxford and Torch channels. In this second and final event in the series, we will explore the themes of community, collectivity, and care, which are threaded throughout the Breathworks collaborative digital project. These questions of community and care, performed through digital technology and within online spaces, have been recurrent in the critical discourse surrounding internet art and digital practice, but they've taken on a renewed significance during the pandemic. With social distancing measures set to remain in place for many months to come, digital technologies and online platforms have been and will continue to be essential for building and maintaining grassroots spaces for creative community. This evening, we reflect on this unprecedented moment and the possibilities that it offers for critical engagement with digital, participatory, and collaborative practices. Drawing on the rich history of community building in digital art and activism, we ask, what does it mean to gather and come together online in the current climate? Who has access to these digital spaces, and how might they be used to establish networks of care, collectivity, and resistance? I'm delighted to be joined this evening by three fantastic speakers. First of all, we have Orit Gat, who is a writer and contributing editor at The White Review and has written about contemporary art and digital culture for a variety of magazines, including Frieze, eFlux, Art Review, and Art in America, to name just a few. Orit won the Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant in the short form writing category in 2015. And Orit is currently working on a non-fiction book that looks at football as a prism through which to explore questions about immigration, nationalism, race, gender, money, love, and the possibility of belonging. Our second speaker this evening is Francesca Sobande, and she's a lecturer in digital media studies at Cardiff University. Francesca is course director of the BA Media Journalism and Culture program and is an affiliate of the Data Justice Lab. Francesca's research particularly focuses on digital culture, Black diaspora, feminism, creative work, and the experiences of Black women. Francesca's research has been published in numerous international journals, and she is author of The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, which was published this year, and is also co-editor of To Exist is to Resist, Black Feminism in Europe, published in 2019. And our final speaker this evening is design activist Maral Pourkazemi. Maral is the co-founder and creative director of the all-woman X-led creative consultancy Mad Thing and is a founding member of the cyber-feminist collective Deep Lab. Maral received widespread critical acclaim for her 2012 infographic, The Iranian Internet Between Freedom and Isolation, and the project was developed into an animated short film titled Beyond Bytes, which received a Kantar Information is Beautiful Award in 2014. Maral's design practice explores questions of freedom, censorship, storytelling, and networks of radical care. So the format for the event this evening is that we're going to hear from Orit, Francesca, and Maral. They'll each speak for 10 to 15 minutes. And this will then be followed by a conversation and some questions. And the event will last just over an hour. And please do ask questions. They can be submitted through the YouTube chat function, and we'll answer as many as we can. So now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Orit.
Thank you, Jessie. So I am gonna start by presenting. I've prepared a pretty conventional talk, let's say. Don't let the unicorn in the sky Wi-Fi symbol to make it seem less serious, but I have a lot of pop culture references coming in because what I wanted to talk about today was basically the culmination of this year in which I think a lot of people's relationship to their digital lives have changed immensely. And I wanted to look a bit at the history of coming together online and try and think about whether it can teach us something about the way we relate to the internet right now, especially because I don't buy this image that's behind me. This image, I took it from the New York Times. It illustrated an article titled, "Is the Internet Nice Now?" It was written by Nellie Bulls, and the feature is about how the coronavirus crisis has ended the screen time debate and how screens won at the end. And she interviews a sociologist called Sherry Turkle. Turkle wrote a best-selling book in 2011 titled Alone Together, which explored how screen-mediated human communication, quote unquote, leads to less meaningful exchanges. And she's been on this like digital loneliness beat for a very long time. Before that, she wrote books called The Power of Talk in a Digital Age and Reclaiming Conversation. I hope that you can hear in my tone just like how uninterested I am in her project. Because for many, many years, people who critically engage with the web and with digital culture have rejected these ideas of how the web is quote unquote making us stupid or how there is no real communication online. So I wanted to think through this moment in which there's obviously like a collapse of the difference between a real life and a quote unquote digital life, and look back and think about other ways in which people have socialized before. Because right now, the platform that is the most emblematic of the change in our digital lives is Zoom. I'm giving this talk on Zoom. Zoom has been around since 2011. It started as an intra-company communication tool, and until very, very recently, it was pretty much only used by organizations paying a fee. Between December 2019 and the end of March 2020, Zoom's daily users have grown 20-fold, from 10 million people to 200 million people. No one is more surprised than Zoom about this, and a lot of web developers were quite amazed by the fact that Zoom's servers have managed to like support this exponential growth. But I think that what's most fascinating about this moment is that this platform, which a lot of people have never used before, were all of a sudden using for work and for school, they also decided to stay on it. They had parties, they had happy hours, they had book clubs and grandparents' story times. There's been so many stories about Zoom funerals and Zoom weddings that I can't even feel anything about it anymore. And Zoom has become a word, obviously. You say, I'm gonna go Zoom someone, I have a Zoom meeting. It stands in for all video chatting the way Skype used to stand in for all video chatting. And I think that one of the really interesting things about it is that it achieved it without being fun at all. Like there are many other platforms like House Party that were really trying to like make that space between labor and socializing much more evident. But people just wanted to stay on the platform that they were already on. People just wanted to socialize as much as possible. And so like even like switching platforms seemed unnecessary, basically. An episode of the podcast The Daily talked about socializing during the pandemic, and it was called Zoom is Now Your Social Network. And I'm really interested in that and how we meet and what it means and what the platforms that we use for it mean. And so to think about it, I've gone back for a couple of older examples. So the thing that inspired me at the beginning was thinking about Zoom not only as a platform for one-on-one interactions or for group conversations, but for a certain focus on liveness, on coming together with other people for talks like this one, which one could see recorded in 2 hours, for music concerts, for watch parties of a movie with other people. The sense that people really wanted to come together at the same time as others and have an experience together reminded me of just how revolutionary this was when I was a kid. This is ICQ circa 2001. I was on ICQ in the late 90s. The pun in the name ICQ is very much intended. And the reason that this chat platform was completely new at the time was that it showed you which users were online at the same time. And so like this idea of like knowing who is around, who is not available, who is away from their computer at a time in which like dial-up connections actually meant that people weren't online all the time, was a very different sense of like coming together with other people. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe you're on the internet as well at the same time. Who knew that we both dialed up at the same time and waited for 3 minutes and now we're both connected? It looks ridiculous now, but in 2000, the World Wide Web Foundation estimates that there were 400 million internet users and ICQ had 100 million users. And so a quarter of the internet was on this messaging platform that was also interestingly not very widely used in the West. But that's an aside that like I still don't fully understand why. So an example of how chat and like the sense that other people are online at the same time as you have changed the way we communicate came to me very recently when I was watching You've Got Mail. It's a rom-com written by Nora Ephron. If you don't know it, from 1998, has Meg Ryan, which you see on my computer there, and Tom Hanks. The story is like a shop around the corner story, and it's an epistolary romance. I would show you the trailer because that would be fun, but it might be a waste of our time. But the reason I was watching it was that a writer I really like, Hanif Abdurraqib, wrote an essay about it for an art magazine called Four Columns, and he called it a 2-hour AOL commercial. And described how the epistolary romance was updated with email during a time in which email was still a novel and exciting way to communicate and not the burden that it is often seen as now. The thing about watching it again is that I was quite stunned by the fact that the moment that the plot really progresses and shoots out is chat. So these two people are emailing, exchanging emails they've never met. And then there's this moment in which Kathleen Kelly is sitting in her apartment and Joe Fox types to her and this like chat window opens on their AOL platform and he says, I had a gut feeling you would be online right now. She gasps and look at the apartment around her to like make sure that he's not standing behind her or something. But it was that simultaneity of chat that builds intimacy between them, and it makes people feel real in ways that they never were before online. And I would argue that this has affected the way we communicate to this day. Okay, in one of the ways that I've been like trying to think about how we were in the past, I was looking at this curatorial project from 2013. It was curated by Jane McHugh, who has been working on digital art and net art for a long time, and it included 60 contributions from artists and writers about their memories of growing up online. I chose a number of quotes from these accounts for you guys, just to give you a sense of like the very sweet image of some of the contributions. They're not all that sweet. It's a very generational project, definitely. McHugh is a curator who's interested in artists who work on the internet, but not in the old generation of net artists, but specifically people who were born in the 80s. And they have a very unique set of references to like what memories of being online is. That my family kept our computer by the kitchen is completely my memory as well, which is probably why I think of it as so sweet. And this, I think, is the moment in which, from instant messaging as the thing that drives the plot, you can have full experiences online with new people, and they shape our ideas of what a self is. And that shift is very particular, and like you see it to this day in the voice that people adopt online. So like it moves from welcome to my David Bowie fan site to like this snarky, ironic voice that you associate with the internet in the mid 2010s, and to the way that people communicate on social media right now, which is very like compliment oriented and very like self-building. And of course, like these 1980 kids are very different. Someone who was born in the 1990s would think of Facebook as a space of exploration of relationships with new people, the way the French artist who writes about how in the spring of 1998, when she was 12 years old and in middle school, her first internet discovery was in class, and she was on AOL chat rooms and like chatting with boys who wanted to be her friends. Obviously, boys who wanted to be your friends is exactly what Facebook is for. Someone who was born in the 2000s would think of Instagram as a way of self-presentation and exploration. I'm quite happy I'm not there. When YouTube started in the early 2000s, it sold itself as quote unquote your digital video repository. And within 10 years, it was changed completely to broadcast yourself. And this idea of the self and the labor that that comes with, and the internet that it builds, the content that goes into the internet, has obviously been monetized and built up for a very long time. This is the cover of Time magazine in 2006, when the magazine chose you as the person of the year. You can see that underneath the subtitle says, yes, you control the information age. Welcome to your world. Seriously, like in 2006, all of the people who were using the internet were collecting around the same websites. Like this idea of your world that wasn't owned by huge companies doesn't really seem real. But of course, this whole piece is super optimistic, and it talks about community and collaboration on a scale never seen before. The cosmic compendium of knowledge that Wikipedia is, the million people's network that YouTube is. That was before there were more videos on YouTube than any human being could ever watch at the same time. They talk about MySpace as an online metropolis. There's a lot of research about how when social media started exploding, a lot of people felt like the senses of self that they developed amongst communities on places like MySpace just completely like disappeared as they grew. Like someone described like you being trans on YouTube and like having a trans community of people like really working on like self-presentation, seeing YouTube grow from like a small town into like the global village, and how that makes you feel possibly unsafe. Time, of course, is busy selling ourselves to ourselves. And so it talks about us balancing our diet of pre-digested news with raw feeds from Baghdad and Boston and Beijing. And I am really fascinated by this next line, which is, you can learn more about how Americans live just by looking at the backgrounds of YouTube videos, those rumpled bedrooms and toy-strewn basements and rec rooms, than you could from thousands of hours of network television. The next thing that I kept thinking about how we socialized was that computer in the kitchen and that sense of home. I didn't even know what a basement rec room was. I grew up in an apartment. But it just really brought up lockdowns, and it just pushed all of this research that I started doing about the history of coming together into where we are now. So when the global lockdown started, Rebecca Jennings, who writes about technology for Vox and is my personal TikTok specialist favorite, published an article on Vox called "Bored Teens Are Making Self-Isolation Content." It reads, "Mostly though, TikTok is useful as a place to see how other people are living through this extremely unprecedented crisis. The app has always been a window into people's homes. It's just that now what we do when we're home alone amounts to the full extent of our lives." During lockdown, and not because of boredom or because of like my empathy and my curiosity about how things are elsewhere. Like I was constantly on TikTok trying to see basically like how the kids are living these days. And like, I constantly wanted a website that would show me what the conditions of life were elsewhere while I was in lockdown. And TikTok was the thing that provided it. And there was an extra layer of it that felt extremely poignant during lockdown, which is that it has this weird form of sociality, and especially the fact that so many of the videos that trend and rise up through TikTok are of synchronized dancing. And so you have to come together with other people, you have to be together in space, you have to practice together. There's so much communication there. And then there's the other extra weird content form, which is content houses or TikTok houses. They don't start with TikTok. There was a content house for Vine stars earlier on, but they really became synonymous with the app. No one calls like the houses of like YouTube stars content houses, but these have become such an established model to make money on TikTok too. Jennings described them as like the boy band model of the 90s. So like they're the calculated product of a talent management company that plucks influencers from across TikTok to form a collective. Call it the boy band model, but for Gen Z, where stars leverage each other's burgeoning fame against a backdrop of multi-million-dollar homes. So what you're seeing here are two different houses. The one on the right is called Hype House, and it was, there's a big New York Times profile of it, which I read with a lot of interest, of course. But one of the most fascinating things was that it said like, in December, the hashtag Hype House accrued 100 million views on TikTok. But the great detail about it was that the pub date on the article was Jan 3rd, like within 3 days of the new year, like, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. The fact that like something like this opens in December and by January, the New York Times has a profile and this very like fancy photo shoot that I have featured here. And then 3 months later, everything changes. But then the first TikTok house in the UK called Byte House opened during the pandemic. And the BBC reported about it, not on their digital culture beat, but on their COVID beat. The report read, 6 of the UK's most popular TikTok content creators have moved in together and are trying to meet a surge in demand from teenagers in lockdown, despite some doubts about the timing. My notes when I was writing about this and thinking about this was how no one on TikTok seems to live alone during lockdown, and how when or as we were all feeling a bit lonely and out of touch with other people, there's this very weird intensity to watching these kids live together. Jennings links the history of collaboration houses to reality TV and the Kardashians, but I would tie it to another history that goes back to my ICQ days, which is MTV's The Real World, and how basically like nothing ever changes. I wasn't really interested in like writing a talk in which I just say that like nothing ever changes, and I didn't want to write a linear history exactly from like instant messaging to self-publishing to social media. Also, all of these things are related, right? Like WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, is a direct continuation of AIM from AOL, which is actually a form of ICQ because AOL bought ICQ and built AIM based on it. I just think that these different histories of socializing are funny and joyful and interesting, and they might tell us more about ourselves right now than we might recognize, specifically because we're thinking in terms of coming together and communality and collectivity. And I kept using these terms instead of one very specific term, which is friendship, because we now seem to differentiate friendship via like the people you actually see versus friendship on Facebook or the way that socializing has been monetized. And so I think that when we talk about how Facebook or Instagram have monetized our relations to each other and how they generate data from it, we need to think back not just about how these platforms affect our relationship to technology, our relationship to our data, but also the way we come together and the language around it. And now just seemed like the right moment to look back, because it might, this history, looking at it, might give us like just a couple of pointers in a toolbox that is definitely being developed, in which we try and understand like a social landscape that is essentially completely new to all of us. Thank you. I'm going to hand this over to Francesca.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say how incredibly interesting that whole presentation was. And I'm teaching a module this semester on meme, myself and I, looking at issues to do with online identities and inequalities. And I know that my students will really enjoy listening to all that we're speaking about today. And what I have to say now will hopefully connect back to some of what we've already covered, and will also make some really sort of strong connections to issues to do with consumer culture, branding, and the commodification of notions of connection, care, and community. So when I was thinking about what I was going to speak about tonight, I kept reflecting on the last 6 months or so and 2020 in general. And I kept thinking about moments when I have felt uncomfortable with the different ways that we've seen commercial organizations essentially make use of the language of care, connectivity, collectivity, and community, but ultimately to promote products and services and to push forms of consumption and consumer culture that are very far removed from the type of grassroots organizing that is really at the heart of community building and care right now, from my point of view. So the title of what I'm speaking about today, We're All in This Together, and sort of questioning, first of all, who's the we that we're thinking about, and how are forms of connection, care, and community digitally mediated in different ways. Oh, so looks as though my slides had decided to freeze, so I'm going to give that another go and hope that technology will be on my side this time. So now that we are really at a point when, as we've already discussed, conversations to do with Zoom, conversations to do with Instagram posting are a very common part of many people's daily lives. I feel as though, or I'm hopeful that we'll see some more discussions that really critically engage with what it means to be incredibly hyper-visible online, and the different opportunities to connect with other people that very much are there, the different forms of sociality and community building that have taken place in digital spaces long before 2020 and sometimes are referred to as though they're new. But really getting to grips with the fact that the internet and how people experience digital technologies and online environments is fundamentally shaped by offline material conditions and intersecting forms of oppression as well. So sometimes conversations will sort of put forward this false binary opposition between online and offline worlds. And that can sometimes involve comments being made that imply there's the opportunity to experience a life online that is free from the sort of inequalities that are really incredibly awful part of society right now, and the sort of past that has led to the situation that many people are dealing with. And for me, I think we can hold space to acknowledge both the different ways that people are coming together online, how digital spaces are being used to create a sense of community or to replicate the forms of offline community that people are not able to access right now. And we can also at the same time acknowledge the fact that not everybody is able to be online. Not everybody does have the sorts of resources which enable them to participate in the conversation we're having right now. And even for people who perhaps are able to access digital technology, they have access to a cheap or an accessible form of internet connection. Because of who they are and because of the forms of inequality that exist in society, they may be particularly susceptible to experiencing forms of harm, abuse, and online violence, which mean that how they participate in a certain digital space or choose to disengage from it can be very different to the experiences of other people. So this slide is me really thinking through some of the opportunities to connect that can be afforded to certain individuals online. So as I've said, the creation of a shared virtual space. And although, many people right now are struggling with the fact that they're not able to meet others in a physical setting, it's also worth us pausing and acknowledging the fact that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, that has been the experience that many other people have had. So sometimes when we speak about issues to do with digital space or the opportunities to connect right now, or the various ways that people are forging a sense of kinship and community, these conversations sometimes occur in relatively ableist ways that fail to acknowledge the different ways that people have for a very long time been dealing with the fact that they're not able to, for various reasons, access certain physical settings. And again, as has already been touched on, it's often very telling when in various media and political spheres that the benefits of digital technology or the benefits of certain digital spaces are referred to as though they have just emerged out of nowhere, and that there hasn't been this long history of examples of people creatively turning to the internet to connect, to collaborate, and to really work in communal ways. So for me, the co-creation of resources here is really important, especially when thinking about the pandemic. And that might involve people collaboratively producing resources that are absent in more mainstream media and political domains. So when we've seen discussions about COVID-19 happen, quite often this term "we" is casually used. But again, for me, we need to be specific. And actually, although the pandemic, you could say, has impacted everybody's life, perhaps to some extent, it's absolutely inaccurate to imply that everybody is experiencing the pandemic in the same way, whether that's because one person is disproportionately more likely to be negatively impacted by COVID-19 or more likely to not survive it as opposed to someone else. Or we have an example whereby one individual has a large garden and lots of green spaces that are available to them in comparison to someone else who's located in a situation where they haven't had access to green spaces for a very long time. So what I see is people going online and creating resources that shed light on the nuanced different experiences that people are having this year, and which also can involve them creating counter narratives. So creating narratives that push against the dominant discussions of the pandemic that sometimes universalize experiences of it in a really unhelpful way that distracts from the different forms of oppression that means some people are struggling with particular problems right now that others just are not. And again, when thinking about some of the more positive moments that I have seen or have been a part of this year, transnational forms of solidarity are always incredibly heartening to see. And I think this is where the affordances of different digital platforms is very, can vary really. So in the previous talk, we heard about the different ways that whether it's ICQ or Instagram or TikTok, there are certain conventions that can surround specific platforms or digital spaces. And for me, when I think about transnational forms of solidarity, whilst they might not be specific to one social media area or one pocket of the internet, I do think when we're dealing with different issues to do with risk, to do with privacy, to do with surveillance, it's worth us acknowledging that it's not helpful to make blanket statements such as digital technology is a fantastic way to pursue transnational forms of solidarity. Rather, within that, we need to critically think about what issues to do with safety are at play, which platforms might be best put to use in comparison to others, and also how do the blurred boundaries between private and public really complicate things when people are trying to support others elsewhere in the world, but are also mindful of the different dangers that they may face. And lastly, for me, another example of how we see digital technology and online community activities very much connected to what's going on in 2020, and something that, again, has long predated it, is how people are attempting to combat both misinformation and disinformation. So this connects to my point to do with counter-narratives and thinking about whose experiences and perspectives are missing from a lot of the mainstream conversations going on. So for me, a lot of my own work as a lecturer in digital media studies at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University in Wales focuses on the experiences of Black people in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. And I've been very conscious of some of the distinct differences I see between how Black people online are sharing information and are really challenging the different ways that we're seeing Black people's experiences of the pandemic be overlooked, be reframed, and the limitations of a lot of mainstream media discourse that fails to adequately acknowledge how anti-Blackness and medical racism is a real part of the problems we are seeing unfolding. So perhaps not the most positive points to be reflecting on, but again, I think when we're dealing with the messiness of digital spaces and online communities, it's only right that we both recognize there can be moments where people use digital technologies to pursue liberationist goals, to come together, to support one another. Again, as I said, to put forward narratives that are absent in other domains. But at the same time, we can't refer to this in a utopian way. So commodification and notions of connection, care, and community. I'm very conscious, as I said, of the different ways that brands have been sort of making symbolic representational gestures to this notion of community and solidarity, but in ways that are often ultimately based on their pursuit of profit as opposed to their prioritization of people. So there's often this disconnect between actually the work and labor experiences that people employed by certain organizations are facing, the push or emphasis on productivity, the push and emphasis on being in physical spaces when it's quite frankly not necessary, and then the image that these commercial organizations are projecting in terms of a so-called concern with community, care, and collectivity. So over the course of this year, I've been looking at different examples of marketing and branding, whether that ranges from the work of influencers and how they're posting about hacks during the pandemic, or how they're starting to align themselves with certain social justice movements, but sometimes, and not always, sometimes ultimately for opportunistic reasons. So for me, when we're speaking about crisis this year, it's not just thinking about the pandemic, we're thinking about what we see going on in terms of anti-Blackness and police brutality globally. We're thinking about the fact that for some people, they may be focused on one crisis right now, but for others, there are many crises that they've been dealing with. And again, when that comes to their digital experiences, that means that what they're participating in, what they're creating, curating and sharing may be very different to some of your own experiences or some of mine. So as I said, I'm really keen that we push against sort of universalized notions of how people are experiencing 2020 and how people experience the internet too. So, you know, there are many problems to do with censorship, to do with shadow banning, to do with whose self-representation online is most likely to be monitored, managed and policed by different organizations. And again, I'm always keen to see that we are critiquing examples of brands co-opting the collective work of grassroots organizations. And again, when we're thinking about the different ways that people are encouraged to be online, how organizations are asking people to be very visible, how individuals who previously were not using digital technologies as part of how they access healthcare, education, how they have to work, and are now being encouraged or coerced or even forced to be present and to be online in ways that make them feel uncomfortable. I want us to always be thinking about whose hypervisibility is going to involve most risk for them, and what do these forms of surveillance mean in the long term as well. Thank you very much for your time. I'm really enjoying being a part of this conversation and looking forward to the questions that follow. And now I'm going to hand over to Maral.
Hello, everybody. I'm really excited for the conversation that comes after this. So far, I've taken probably 2 pages worth of notes. But before that, I want to tell you a little bit about my part of the story. Basically, as you should see, a small collection of projects and experiences of radical care for in and about digital spaces. And I found it very important for my own story to maybe start way before the pandemic. At the project that Jesse mentioned in the beginning, which is called the Iranian Internet Between Freedom and Isolation. I am a design activist, self-proclaimed. I've learned communications designs, and there was a time where I didn't know what to do with my skills. So I ended up becoming a design activist because I was working on the, actually on a pitch at an advertising agency on McDonald's during a time where the Iranian movement in 2006 happened, where I'm going to click you through this. There was a presidential elections between the hardliner Ahmadinejad and the opposition Mousavi, and people thought the election was going to be rigged, and it seemed like it was. People took to the streets. This has nothing to do with the internet yet, but you'll see that at the time, I don't know if people remember, but there was a time where journalists were there, but they were kicked out of the country. This is very a meme from back then, actually, where the Iranian officials kicked every other broadcasting channels out of the country to not see the brutality that was happening on the streets in Iran. So there I was sitting at McDonald's, sorry, not at McDonald's, but at an advertising agency working on a pitch for McDonald's, 33 hours in, thinking to myself, what the hell am I doing with myself? I am a designer. Is this my only path? No. I'm interested in something else. I'm actually interested in what's happening online in the country where my parents are from, about privacy, censorship, and security. So I had to take a few days off from the agency. I pretended to be sick, managed to put together a proposal for my master's degree for University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam, managed to get through with the flimsiest application you'd ever see, an actual embarrassment as a designer, but what was in it was more important than how it looked. So essentially what had happened is that I managed to learn and understand what it meant to connect and to use the power of the network to work on something I had absolutely no clue about, right? So we're talking about, I describe it as the Iranian internet. You know, it's not the global internet. It's something that is different to the internet that we are experiencing on our side of the world. And as an Iranian myself, and having been there at the time, obviously things have changed since then, and how the internet functions over there. What had happened during this political movement was extremely fascinating to me. And mind you, this was way before the Arab Spring, where the internet was becoming a popular tool, the only way to manage to get your voice out, share information with the outside world, when no news channels would be able to even get anywhere close to this. Now, this is a time where where news channels would have quite a lot of difficulties to verify information that will come from the internet, right? Excuse me. To verify that kind of information now is obviously a different story. You'll see people quoting TikTok and Instagrams and all of that on newscasts and that sort of stuff. Back then it was slightly different. So when I think about networks of radical care and sort of not just radical care, but just radicalness, what was very fascinating during that time and this research that I managed to put together is that the users inside of Iran had to use circumvention tools in order to get out with the pictures, the images, the news about what was happening inside of the country. And even inside the country, you wouldn't be able to get that information. Actually, it felt like people outside Iran would know a lot more about the uprising than the people inside Iran. And that's all because a lot of people managed to circumvent the internet. I have to say, circumventing the censorship of the Iranian internet is an offense sometimes when it suits the government. So basically what that means is that the Iranian officials would be able to, whenever it suits them, to detain or track down or find users, torture, and also kill them. This is what happened at the time, for spreading information or misinformation in their eyes to the world. So that's what happened after this research, is that I've put together this visual exploration, this visual narrative of how many users are inside of Iran, which people seem to be connected better than others, who's using what kind of circumvention tools, how you can become an accidental activist, some unfortunate stories of people who have been detained and lost their lives for just being online at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and where the power comes from. This sounds really alien even now still, that I talk about this many years after. What was really powerful with this piece was that what was important to me is that I needed to capture this moment in time, because we only had bookmarks of things happening that would also dust down or die out eventually, digital bookmarks, and not actually anything else. There's no trace of this digital movement that was coming from Iran before the Arab Spring. As working or becoming a founding member to Deep Lab, a collective of cyber feminists, researchers, artists, new media artists, designers, developers, you name it. These are all female identifying individuals. We very dearly care about online and online security and privacy. We got together the first time at a residency that was hosted by the CMU, the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where I think there was about 12 of us who most of us have never seen each other, have come together. And again, I received an email out of the blue, which felt like an absolute scam, asking me to participate in this. Every expense would be covered. For some reason, I said yes. I turned up and I said, why the hell are we here? And it turns out everyone is connected. Everyone's work is linked to what's happening online or has some connection to the digital world. During our time at the CMU, we created lots of commentary and poetic and very poignant work around relationships with privacy and security. We held talks about it. We have people from different age groups in there, in the group. One talk that I remember very, very much is from, at the time, Maddie Varner, who was at the time 19 years old, telling us about how her entire life is online. It will always be from the moment that she was born. There's no trace of her anymore. And that, for some reason, it feels normal, but also extremely strange. At the time when we were at the CMU, we also, the CIA torture report came out as well as part of a massive leak. We worked that into an installation at the CMU also. We have since met a few more times in New York, in York, in the UK also, to continue our work around online and now also offline privacy and security, creating safe spaces of exchange. This collective itself is a safe space where we can explore different avenues of online and offline security and privacy. Since then, I've really been working on lots of data stories, data visualizations that capture a lot of communities around, especially actually in Iran, religious minorities and how they communicate online, the conservatives and hardliners that and how they communicate online, and how the movements are with like fake accounts and trolling and shitstorming the opposition. Very interesting stuff, but also very heart-wrenching. So I kind of like stepped away from that a little bit, but I have then continued working with my own studio and other things. So now I'm gonna like fast forward all the way to probably about last year. Very small project that we've done actually this year for International Women's Day. A quick thing that we wanted to do, I found it very relevant to bring into this talk because it touches upon some of the things that have been mentioned so far. It was a very quick thing that we wanted to put out into the world. as part of a different collective called Coup d'etat, which means the overthrow of the establishment, of course. It's a music collective, also women run and women supporting and just for women and queer women here in London. We created this fundraiser called "Cause I'm a Woman," based on a track that was published in support of Black trans women, and we have approached Everpress to help us spread the word so that we can get as much funds as possible to donate to a certain charity that would help us with the cause. All of the proceeds were going to this. I managed to get to talk to 2 people from Everpress at the time who shot me down because they said there's so many cool projects. If we had to, we would like to support all of them, but we can't. And then halfway into lockdown, the Black Lives Matter movement kicks off here, which it rightly so has, and I see that Everpress is now pushing a lot of BLM GARMs onto their website, onto the newsletter, and they should really do that. But I couldn't, it really didn't like feel good to me. It felt like they are now jumping on a bandwagon and using or abusing the waves that the BLM are making for their own profit or for their own good. So I called them out on it. I actually emailed them back and I expressed how I felt about their what feels like selecting the content that they want to put out into the world, obviously based on what's happening in the news, and that I felt that this was disingenuous and it didn't really suit their brand, and it made me really question the purpose or like who they are. Anyways, I actually got a response, and they seemed to be apologetic, offered to put the fundraiser up again or put another fundraiser up with us. We can discuss this experience further. I'd love to hear the other voices to that. So now we're still in the pandemic. Another project that we did also to create a safe space or a place of community online, a space of care, not a digital space of care, but a space of care that is available for those that actually don't have easy access or don't know how to access digital spaces. Right in the beginning of lockdown, our small collective, Mad Thing, got really concerned about the elderly, the most vulnerable in society, and people in care homes, of course, the most vulnerable people. So we kind of invented something that was invented before, or reinvented something, just a phone line. Essentially, we programmed it with the purpose of wanting to connect an absolute stranger with someone who just needs a chat. And the purpose of that was to tackle lockdown loneliness. It was aimed to be used by the elderly or the most vulnerable in our communities. I just remember this should probably be a good idea to actually talk about our challenges here also, because by the time we were finished with programming the software behind it and to build it and to lock in our partnerships, the partnerships of the infrastructure that would carry the website, carry the phone number so that we don't have to pay for it, no one has to pay for it, not even the callers. We ended up having a massive issue with actually releasing this, because suddenly we were aware of a danger that would potentially put the people that are calling into danger of being scammed. So, and that is because we wanted to literally be able to connect absolute strangers without them having to go through a vetting or training to be able to speak to someone who needs a chat. so I'll leave it at that. Then the next project that we started doing during the lockdown is called Robin Good, where we wanted to create a tool that is for the people, for us, for people that have lost faith in the government and the regulations and restrictions and confusing messages that were coming from the top down. So we created basically a simple form that would allow normal people to just, when they go out, let's say to Sainsbury's and they want to do a shop there and they see that there's too many people not wearing masks, or the staff is not looking at it, it's not like regulating social distancing, essentially a tool that allows you to shout into it whenever you feel unsafe about yourself, about you being present in a space that should care about COVID safety measures. This kind of snowballed into becoming something that could even track racism in certain establishments and places of business. So we applied for a couple of sources of funding here, unfortunately with absolutely no success so far. We kind of think that it might actually give the people too much power, which is why we haven't heard back from any of the even government funds that were. It seemed like it was raining money for technologies like this one, but not for us. So we're currently putting this on hold until we can fund this ourselves. And yeah, so this is meant, this specific digital space, we see it as a safe space. We see it as something that is never going to be given away to potential, I don't know, like you'd think that there's a big corporation behind this, but it's not. There's people that care about health and safety and moving it through this current world in a way that keeps everyone safer. So I think my ending notes in this little get together here or my question to the other speakers would be, what's your thoughts about the downfalls of the connectivity, and yeah, basically I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maral, Francesca, and Orit, for those fantastic presentations. And there's so much that we can kind of explore and unravel from that. I would like to encourage the audience to ask us some questions. Please do, we'd love to respond to them. But perhaps let's start off with Maral's question there. And let's can you just repeat that, Maral?
Yeah. I'm trying to like string my thoughts together. I'm also terribly ADHD. I apologize for like jumping back and forth so much. So it's coming from a feeling I have inside of me about digital spaces, digital fake safe spaces, and the abuse of a dire situation that we see ourselves in at the moment. And from our point of view, from the point of view of the works that we put into the world, the total disregard of what we think is a genuine initiative. It feels stuck. It feels like, how do we get to the point of visibility, actually? That's probably what it is. Maybe it's probably more thought.
I would like to hear Francesca speak about this more than myself, but I feel like if there's one thing that I have noticed specifically in the past few months is this like pressure to participate in certain discourses because they felt as if they were unfolding visually online. Probably they only seem as if they unfold visually to me because I'm an art critic. But I've seen Burger King try and like teach people how to stay sane during self-isolation, and then a week later freak out about that sweet content they were trying to produce because Black Lives Matter was happening. And Burger King has to say something because they've already been participating in this way. But again, this is me thinking so much about like major platforms and the way they take advantage of us. And I think that Francesca might have a lot more insight.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I couldn't agree more with you both. And certainly something that I've been looking at a lot and having conversations with friends and family and students about is really this role of digital remix culture and user-generated content and memes, and the different ways that brands are trying to tap into digital spaces and activities that were perhaps once associated with more of a DIY approach and a collective approach, to position themselves as being in proximity to certain social justice movements. So I do a lot of work on this concept of woke washing, which is when we see commercial organizations and individuals, perhaps, you know, self-influencers and self-brands, trying to essentially access some social capital and clout that they have identified as being associated with being visible amidst media discourse to do with social justice movements, but without actually being involved on the ground themselves. So I think a great example of some of what we're talking about is when we saw the Black squares trending on social media and trending in ways that were actually distracting from the information being shared by grassroots organizers, and also were being used by different brands that we know have a track record of not caring about these issues. So the examples that you've both been speaking about very much resonate with me. And I think that certainly I'm fascinated to see how brands continue to sort of wade into the waters with regards to trying to contribute to conversations to do with anti-Blackness, anti-racism, to do with different forms of structural oppression. And for me, ultimately, that will often involve much more of a surface level and sort of shallow effort to protect reputational risk, as opposed to any meaningful engagement with people doing the grassroots work and any sort of sustained support that doesn't involve platforming the brand themselves, but instead involves identifying ways to really amplify the work that's already happening.
This also has a history in like the social media revolutions, right? And the fact that social media companies were really trying to sell themselves during the Green Revolution, during the Arab Spring, as like spaces of like a Western idea of liberation.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think we're seeing this sort of consumption is often confused with liberation, and we're seeing these messages being pushed whereby it's sort of buy your way to freedom, and these messages can be further from the sort of work that needs to happen and the sort of work that is happening. And like you said, I do think it's important for us to reflect on how you know, Western notions of value are a part of this, and also global hierarchies and global media flows too, and whose experiences of inequality and oppression tend to garner more attention than others. So, you know, even within conversations to do with Black Lives Matter and anti-Blackness, you know, how often are we hearing from Black people who experience homophobia and transphobia and classism and ableism as well?
Absolutely. And we've just had a question from the audience, which I'm going to bring in now, which is how has the speed of development that Orit discussed contributed to the issues that Maral talked about?
It's a good question. Think about that one. Do you want to answer it, Orit?
I feel like I feel like I'm gonna I think that it gives you like a moment of grace, right? Like, I don't want to seem like too like techno-determinist, but there are moments in which people communicate on platforms before the government has fully figured out that they are doing that. And that communication, like, I swear that somewhere I have an example of like organizing on YouTube comments and people just realizing that like there are these public spaces that are owned by Google. Will Google pay for the server space? And yet you can like casually organize if people know where to find each other online. So like new technologies would also allow for like, until those technologies are shut down, there is like a grace period and people find communities like self-organize.
I think something very moving and shocking and heartbreaking that happened during the pandemic in Beirut, and how actually with the explosion that happened there, and how I have hardly seen anything on news channels, but most of my information was coming direct and almost instantly from social networks, right? From friends and family that live over there, but relentlessly for weeks and still coming through. When the attention to that matter, that thing that happened, that tragedy that happened, was pulled away as soon as the explosion settled from the actual the media as we know it. So I think that's something powerful that's happened there. But I think also the relentlessness, I mean it in a positive way, because it's keeping the issue alive, the tragedy, and but also the support underground, and like specifically in Beirut, alive. Now I lost my train of thought there. It's a good example, but it's driven by the people, right? It's driven by the grassroots. It's driven by the activists that are on the ground, and every single person that's going online is an activist. That's speaking about this is an activist. And we have, it's for me right now to that thing that happened to the Lebanese, and also BLM 100%. If you don't stop talking about this, then you lose the visibility that you so desperately need to trigger a change, or just to kickstart a change in thinking patterns and opinion shaping. I think that's sort of like I see this from two sides. One is this effort to keep an issue alive, but then also, what if you run out of the energy for it, right? So that momentum is gone, and then you'd have to put so much more effort into it than originally put into a matter to kick it back up onto the algorithm, and that I think is detrimental to authentic and genuine movements.
Absolutely, and something that I've been thought a little bit about is this. I'm really interested in this idea of like operating within these mainstream platforms, and that they're easily accessible and they're so important in times of crisis. And I think something that the Black Squares really showed was that had the effect of masking, hours, days, all of this labor of activism that was being held in that hashtag. And I'm interested to hear what you think about this things like the hashtag, which maybe operate between platforms and are not kind of limited to one space, and how they might be used to kind of create kind of communities and collectivities that kind of slip between different spaces and maybe kind of go under the radar in that way.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, I guess for me it sort of comes back to a point which I feel we're all reiterating, which is there are moments when some of these things can be perhaps put to good use, or can function in ways that can be part of bigger projects that aren't solely dependent, on a hashtag, but connect to wider collective grass movements. But I think that especially, and I'll be a broken record here, but always bringing it back to sort of commodification and racial capitalism specifically, because I think sometimes when we speak about the role of consumer culture in this and capitalism, the racialized and racist nature of that is lost. But when I think of the ways we see, hashtags being used, or hashtags being sort of weaponized and tapped into by organizations for branding and public relations purposes, I think that it can be very tricky actually for hashtags to have the desired long-term effect at times when used as part of different social justice oriented activities. So that's not me being dismissive of the role of hashtags in work we've seen happening. And there's a fantastic book on hashtag activism, I believe by Sarah Jackson, Moya Bailey, and Brooke Foucault-Wells, I think. And there are many different examples of the role of hashtags in incredible forms of transnational collective organizing. But I think especially when we consider 2020 and how brands are again trying to sort of humanize themselves by making use of digital remix culture, I think unless we're critically aware of and sensitive to how these hashtags can operate in ways that actually uphold racial capitalism or the forms of oppression that those hashtags were created to tackle, then there's a real risk again that we shift our focus from the movements and the people doing the work to the brands that are trying to put forward their image by being a part of the conversation.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask you a question? Do you think that the abuse and misuse of hashtags by brands, that people can now, especially during this time, actually see through that, and they can filter, we have, our bullshit filter has become so much more fine-tuned, right? And there's a thing that a lot of friends of mine and I say, that once the pandemic is over, there's a lot of brands that are just going to be graveyard brands just because of this. Mm-hmm. So I almost feel like, okay, I've got an idea that I'm just going to put into the room: the danger of effortlessness. Hashtag culture is part of it, right? I feel like the reactiveness of, if we stay with the hashtag, the reactiveness of online communications and online, like short-circuit online activism or participation, there is a danger to how short-lived the short-livedness of it, right? And because it's so easy to participate, but only for a split second and for one image, and the damage actually that with the black squares that were posted, the damage actually that caused is a good example of this idea.
I really want to value our digital lives and really think about, one of the reasons that I talk about major platforms all the time, like Instagram and TikTok, is that while I think the Signal is amazing and it allows you to have encrypted messaging, it's really easy to use, it's free, most people don't have Signal on their phone and they don't know how to keep themselves safe. And when they ask me how to, because they live in the Middle East, or because they have this moment in which they understand that they need more of an understanding of digital privacy, the answer is always go on WhatsApp. Go on this platform that is owned by Facebook, but is encrypted end to end and is actually safer for you than iMessage is. And so there's these complicated moments in which you end up in compliance with what you think of as evil or as determining our social lives, but also, to go back to the hashtag question, once you're on the popular platforms, you allow people to come together without having any predetermined idea of what it means to participate. And so the education around BLM, I think, is massive. I think a lot of people have learned a lot about how politics work and how organizing works from being educated about the Black Square moment.
Absolutely. So we've had one more question, which I think we've kind of answered a little bit already. Oh, hang on, we've got another one here. Okay, somebody has asked, I was wondering how you see the inherent pressures of these platforms affecting the dynamics between different communities, i.e. How we form solidarities or antagonisms.
That feels like a Maral question.
Yeah. So I think I'll add to the dangers of effortlessness, possibly the dangers of opinion shaping, too quick opinion shaping. It feels like, I don't know, for me at least, online at the moment, everything wants to seem as if it is black and white, as if it is one way or another and nothing in between. Actually, this line that I had on my last slide, I wanted to make that a gap between the enhanced effect of what the enhanced feeling of solidarity right now that we have, but also the opposite of that, which for me is an effect of the COVID effect, or the TikTok effect, I call it that, right? So I can't really answer that question. I just find it very difficult at the moment for community building. It is possible, but it's very difficult. There's always a network that you can tap into. There's always, if there's one thing, there's always a niche, a group, something that you can pull together, whatever corner they come from. You can hate on something together, you can build something together. That will never change, but I find the longevity of these connections a little bit impatient at the moment, if that makes sense. It is because of the effortlessness, and I think that there's, I think that's the best way I can put it. There's impatience online that you can feel everywhere.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I agree. I think what's tricky is there can be such a focus on immediacy and sort of virality and having something to say and post at all times online. And often I feel as though conversations to do with connection and community and collective organizing right now, sometimes the focus is only on what's happening, not only online, but what's visible. I think that's an important distinction too. And sometimes when we speak about digital, we just focus on social media and we don't think about the different ways that digital technologies or creativity are part of various forms of collective organizing that we're not aware of or aren't visible to us in different ways. So I agree. I think sometimes what's helpful for us to come back to is looking at the longevity of different forms of community work and grassroots organizing that can involve digital media. It might involve hashtags, it might involve the different sort of digital spaces we're speaking about, but that's by no means all that it is. And I think that's the sort of core of the work that gives me hope is, we're seeing people, as we said, value what it means to take part in digital spaces and not dismiss the notion of digital lives. So my new book on the digital lives of Black women in Britain is sort of dealing with some of these questions to do with what does it mean to be in digital spaces that we know put us at risk, but can also offer us moments of connection and community. And yeah, I feel as though all of what we're saying comes back to not just the offline or the online, but looking at how all of this is part of the one material reality and the one life that someone is experiencing, whether that is in visible ways in digital spaces or in different, more private settings with people they're working with.
Definitely, I think that's such an important point, and it makes me think of some of the work that Deep Lab was doing around exactly like work that wasn't visible and kind of creating projects that perhaps were not visible, exploring the deep web and like that kind of thing, and exploring those ideas around this kind of visibility, and particularly in relation to surveillance and privacy, that are just so fascinating. We've got one final question because we've gone way over time, but it's a really interesting one. It's about Zoom, so I think we should address it, which is, what does everybody make of the architecture of the space that Zoom is constructing and what it means around the production of identity? For example, the move towards the neutral space as a background and a space in habit. Do you think that these structures start to construct our relations either in this space or IRL?
This is such a great question. I feel like we could talk about this for hours, like aesthetic labor in Zoom and the sort of classed politics of backgrounds and what you choose to share, what you choose to hide, or even sometimes the assumption that the decision to feature a neutral background is maybe in response to expectations of so-called sort of professionalized images, as opposed to part of efforts to maintain a degree of privacy. So I'll leave it there because otherwise I could ramble on, but I think it's a really brilliant question, and I'm excited to be in conversation with you both today because you're doing the sort of work that helps me to think through this stuff.
I also want to add another thing to the aesthetic of the empty background, which is it's a safety concern as well. And there's a lot of research done about, specifically by women, about how like the metadata of images can really help people understand where you live or where you are, and thus having an empty background in which no one can see a bookshelf and recognize that it was only made by IKEA and sold in Sweden in this year. And know more about where you live or who you are. But yeah, I also think that like the liveness of Zoom that I talked about and this like expectations of it being more real somehow, like that, like your Zoom background will tell people something about how you live and the rooms that you inhabit and your class and your ideas of your professional participation. These are also like parts of the things that make people kind of accept it and like take this very corporate model and be like, oh, I'll use this to like chat with my friends as well, because neutrality is always emphasized, like this like business like corporate mannerism is always emphasized on it.
As you can see, I'm totally going against that. I thought about, I think Jessie and we talked about, or I just brought this up as like, what background am I going to do? And then I thought to myself, I should not overthink it. And I think I've been lucky, one of the few lucky ones to, I don't know if you can consider it lucky, but I find it quite endearing. The Zoom calls that I had mostly was either looking into someone's nostrils or bad, but quite unflattering angle. I quite like that because it makes, I personally find it very human, and I think I echo everything that's been said about it, and I totally understand the dangers that come with the background. Yeah, but I think yeah, that's my take on it.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap things up now. Thank you so much to Francesca, Orit, and Maral. These were such fantastic presentations, and I just think that this was, such a timely and important conversation, and to really situate some of the conversations and debates that are taking place right now within this broader critical context and this like really rich history of digital practice and digital activism. Is just so important right now, as we've discussed. So thank you so much for all of your wonderful presentations. It's just been so great. Thank you also to Holly and Nikki, who've been behind the scenes from Torch running the event. And also thanks to Andre and Lucy, and also Amy for their support in organizing this event. So thank you so much, and goodbye.